2,000 men stood ready to kill each other on an October afternoon. Not a single soldier wore a red coat from the British Isles. Every man on the field was an American. Only one officer present had been born on British soil. The rest were neighbors, brothers, and enemies in a brutal civil war. Major Patrick Ferguson stood on the rocky summit of Kings Mountain. He was the only British-born regular officer in the entire colonial theater. Below him, the landscape of the South Carolina backcountry lay in ruins. The British had seized Charleston in May of 1780. General Horatio Gates had suffered a catastrophic defeat at Camden in August. General Charles Cornwallis now believed the southern colonies were finally broken. Cornwallis relied on local loyalist militias to hold the frontier. He tasked Ferguson with turning these militias into a disciplined force. Ferguson was an innovative officer who championed the use of breech-loading rifles. He walked the perimeter of his camp on the high, narrow ridge. He boasted that the position was so strong that even rebels from hell could not take it. His words echoed across the mountain as he prepared for a final showdown. The backcountry was a powder keg of resentment and violence. Ferguson issued a formal proclamation to the men of the frontier. He threatened to lay waste with fire and sword if they did not surrender. The frontiersmen did not retreat into the shadows of the mountains. They gathered their horses and rifles at the edge of the Watauga River. On September 25, 1780, the disparate militia units rendezvoused at Sycamore Shoals. William Campbell arrived with his men from the Virginia border. Isaac Shelby brought his volunteers from the Tennessee Territory. John Sevier led his own contingent of hardened mountain fighters. Benjamin Cleveland and James Williams joined them with their local forces. These men shared no single commander and operated as an independent coalition. They looked toward the horizon with the singular intent of hunting down Ferguson. The march through the dense wilderness was a test of endurance. Horses slogged through rain-soaked trails and deep, muddy gullies. The men moved with the quiet efficiency of experienced woodsmen. They navigated the rugged terrain of the North Carolina and South Carolina border. Every mile brought them closer to the ridge where the Loyalist forces waited. The atmosphere in the woods grew heavy with the promise of imminent violence. Ferguson remained confident in the height and steepness of his chosen ground. His soldiers cleared the brush to create clear lines of fire. They stacked rocks and felled trees to fortify the rocky peak. The Loyalists watched the tree line for any sign of the approaching enemy. The afternoon of October 7, 1780, brought a sudden stillness to the mountain. The coalition of Patriot militias emerged from the forest at the base of the ridge. The Patriots dismounted and tied their horses to the low-hanging branches. They began to encircle the mountain in a tightening ring of steel. The battle for the Southern Department had reached its absolute breaking point. The coming hour would decide the fate of the British invasion. The militia commanders checked their flintlocks and prepared to ascend the slope. The silence of the mountain broke as the first shots rang out. The men gathered in the shadow of the Appalachian peaks. They carried long hunting rifles and leather pouches filled with lead shot. William Campbell arrived with his riders from the Virginia frontier. Isaac Shelby brought his volunteers from the distant Tennessee Territory. John Sevier marched his men down from the high mountain passes. Benjamin Cleveland and James Williams joined the column with their local units. These men hailed from the rugged backcountry of the Carolinas and Virginia. The group lacked a single commander to dictate their movements. They functioned as a loose coalition of independent militia forces. Each man rode for the same singular purpose on this autumn morning. They intended to track down the British major and his Loyalist followers. The scouts scanned the horizon for smoke or tracks in the dirt. They moved with the quiet efficiency of men used to wilderness travel. The horses trudged through narrow trails choked with fallen timber. Rain turned the dirt paths into thick, sucking pools of mud. The riders shielded their powder horns against the damp mountain air. They navigated the steep terrain of the North Carolina border. Every mile brought the coalition closer to the British encampment. The men slept on the cold ground beneath blankets of wool. Major Patrick Ferguson marched his own force toward a high ridge. He reached the summit of Kings Mountain on October 6, 1780. The terrain consisted of a steep, rocky spine covered in dense forest. Ferguson walked the perimeter of the ridge to inspect his defenses. He ordered his men to stack stones and fell trees for cover. He claimed the position was so strong that no rebels could take it. His voice carried across the rocky peak as he prepared his lines. The Loyalists watched the tree line for any sign of the approaching militia. They kept their muskets primed and their bayonets fixed to the barrels. The mountain air grew thin and cold as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Ferguson waited on the summit for the enemy to show themselves. The Patriots emerged from the forest at the base of the mountain. The struggle for the Southern Department began in the dying light. The militia leaders dismounted and tied their horses to the trees. They checked their flintlocks and prepared to ascend the steep slope. The coalition formed a circle around the base of the rocky ridge. They spread out through the woods to surround the Loyalist position. The tactical advantage shifted as the Patriots reached the lower ground. The first shots of the engagement shattered the mountain silence. The sun hung low over the ridge at 3 in the afternoon. The Patriot militia reached the base of Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780. The men jumped from their horses and tied the reins to low branches. They carried long-barreled hunting rifles and heavy leather pouches. The forest floor rose sharply toward the rocky summit. The Loyalists waited behind a defensive perimeter of stacked stones and timber. Major Patrick Ferguson stood atop the ridge in his checkered hunting shirt. The Patriot forces spread out into a wide, encircling line. They moved through the trees using the Indian style of combat. Each man sought cover behind the thick trunks of ancient oaks. The first volley of musket fire tore through the mountain air. The Loyalists returned fire from their elevated position. Smoke curled from the barrels and clung to the damp undergrowth. Ferguson watched the Patriots advance through the dense brush. He signaled for his men to fix their steel bayonets. The Loyalist line surged forward in a desperate bayonet charge. The Patriot militia retreated down the slope to escape the cold steel. The Loyalists pushed them back toward the base of the mountain. The charge lost momentum as the Loyalists reached the lower incline. The Patriots regrouped in the shadows of the trees. They turned back toward the summit and opened fire again. Ferguson ordered a second bayonet charge against the encroaching lines. The Patriots fell back once more under the threat of the blades. The cycle of advance and retreat repeated across the rocky terrain. The forest echoed with the rhythmic crack of long rifles. Ferguson galloped along the ridge to rally his wavering troops. His uniform stood out against the gray stone of the summit. A cluster of lead balls struck him in the chest. The major tumbled from his horse and fell onto the mountain soil. His body lay still near the center of the Loyalist line. The remaining officers struggled to maintain the defensive perimeter. The Patriot militia pushed upward in a final concentrated wave. The Loyalist resistance fractured under the relentless pressure. The battle lasted for 65 minutes of intense close-quarters fighting. The mountain ridge surrendered to the advancing militia. The white flag rose above the smoke of the ridge. The Loyalist firing line sagged as the officers fell. Patriot rifles continued to crack from the cover of the timber. Men in the woods fired into the center of the Loyalist ranks. The survivors dropped their muskets into the dirt of the summit. They raised their hands toward the surrounding circle of militia. The memory of the Waxhaws massacre burned in the minds of the victors. Many Patriots remembered the slaughter at the Battle of Waxhaws in May 1780. They shouted for no quarter as the Loyalists attempted to surrender. Bullets struck down men who had already cast aside their weapons. The carnage continued, despite the clear sign of capitulation. Patriot commanders struggled to regain control of their enraged men. The smoke slowly cleared to reveal the scale of the destruction. 244 Loyalists lay dead upon the mountain. 163 wounded men groaned in the tall grass. 668 survivors stood as prisoners of the militia. The Patriot toll was significantly lighter by comparison. 28 men from the frontier forces died on the slope. 62 others suffered wounds during the hour of fighting. The mountain air grew heavy with the smell of black powder and blood. The victors stripped the dead of their uniforms and supplies. They gathered the weapons abandoned by the defeated Loyalist force. The silence of the summit replaced the rhythmic roar of the rifles. The battle had claimed the life of the only British regular on the field. Major Patrick Ferguson lay dead among his shattered defensive perimeter. The remaining militia leaders surveyed the broken ground of Kings Mountain. The collapse of the Loyalist network left a vacuum in the backcountry. The prisoners moved slowly down the rocky trail under armed guard. The victors prepared to march their captives toward the lowlands. The victory changed the entire trajectory of the war in the South. What would happen to the men who had fought for the crown? The militia leaders turned their attention to the prisoners of war. They marched the captured Loyalists toward the camp at Bickerstaff's old fields. The autumn wind whipped across the open fields at Bickerstaff's. The Patriot militia gathered around a makeshift camp on the North Carolina frontier. Hundreds of defeated Loyalists sat in the dirt with their hands bound. William Campbell and the other leaders stood near the center of the encampment. They convened a Drumhead court-martial to address the conduct of the prisoners. The judges reviewed charges of treason, desertion, and murder against the captives. The atmosphere grew heavy with the desire for retribution. The memory of past violence fueled the anger of the militia guards. The court identified specific men accused of committing atrocities against local families. The judges reached a verdict for the first group of prisoners. Soldiers led 9 men toward a large oak tree at the edge of the field. The executioners placed nooses around the necks of the condemned loyalists. The ropes tightened as the men were lifted from the ground. The sound of the struggle echoed through the quiet camp. The remaining prisoners watched the scene from the cold grass. The militia guards grew increasingly unruly as the hangings continued. The mob threatened to kill every captive in the field. The violence threatened to spiral beyond the control of the officers. The Patriot leaders moved to intervene before the situation collapsed entirely. John Sevier and Isaac Shelby stepped between the guards and the remaining prisoners. They ordered the executioners to cease the hangings immediately. The mob slowly dispersed as the officers regained control of the lines. The remaining prisoners remained huddled in the darkness of the camp. The event at Bickerstaff's underscored the brutal nature of the civil conflict. Neighbor had fought against neighbor across the southern backcountry. The internal divisions of the war left deep scars on the colonial population. The commanders prepared to march the survivors toward more secure facilities. The question of how to manage the prisoners remained a persistent burden. The immediate threat of British retaliation hung over the northern horizon. The militia leaders looked toward the next strategic hurdle for the revolution. The victory at Kings Mountain had secured a tactical advantage. The path toward the British base at Winnsboro remained the primary objective. The army began to organize for the long movement through the wilderness. The news of the disaster on the mountain reached the British command. Major General Charles Cornwallis received the reports at his headquarters in Charlotte. The loss of his primary intelligence and screening force shattered his plans. The planned invasion of North Carolina stalled in the autumn rain. Cornwallis realized his flank was now exposed to the frontier militias. The British Army began a difficult retreat toward the south. Soldiers packed their heavy supplies into wagons on the muddy roads. The column moved slowly through the dense forests of the Carolina backcountry. They retreated to the safety of the base at Winnsboro, South Carolina. The defeat at Kings Mountain had effectively dismantled the Loyalist network. Frontier farmers no longer feared the threat of fire and sword. The momentum of the Southern campaign shifted toward the American forces. The British dream of pacifying the Southern colonies began to dissolve. The Revolution found new life in the rocky terrain of the interior. You look at the records and see a distant, forgotten civil war. But the fear of a neighbor turning against you does not stay buried. The threat of that thin line between order and chaos remains today. You are living in the silence that follows the final shot.